Welcome to Audiobook 365 Stories.
Side by side, they walked across the meadows. The larks flew up in front of them, singing as they went up to the sky. The river moved quietly to the sea. The green trees moved gently in the summer wind. Above them was the long, gray stone building of Windwood Hall. Lord Leicester was very quiet for a few minutes after he asked, "Are you angry?" Stella walked next to him, sometimes bending down to pick a flower. She looked at his face and wondered if her uncle was wrong. Maybe they were all wrong about Lord Leicester. He seemed quiet and kind, with a beautiful face and soft eyes. People thought he was wild, reckless, and bad. She almost forgot how he looked the first night they met, with his whip in the air and anger in his eyes. Suddenly, he spoke, surprising Stella, who was lost in her thoughts about him. "I have been wondering," he said, "how Mr. Etheridge feels about the change you must bring to the cottage." Stella looked up, surprised, then she smiled. "He accepts it well," she said, with a playful smile that her uncle found funny. Lord Leicester looked down at her. "Is that a scolding for my question?" he asked. "No," said Stella. "I did not mean to be rude. Think about it. Your uncle has lived alone all his life, like a hermit. Suddenly, a young girl, full of life and dreams, comes into his life. It must be a big change." "As I said," Stella said, "he accepts it bravely." Then she added in a quieter voice, "He is very good to me." "He could not be otherwise," was the quiet reply. "I mean, he could not be anything but good, gentle, and loving with anyone. I have known him since I was a boy," he added. "He was always the same, always living a life of dreams. I wonder if he thinks you are a dream." "A very real and important one, then," said Stella with a little laugh. "One that is there all day." He looked at her with a serious look that she found hard to meet. "And you?" he asked. "Me?" said Stella, even though she knew what he meant. He nodded. "How do you like the change? This quiet life in the Thames Valley. Are you tired of it already? Do you miss all the fun you had before?" Stella looked up at him. His eyes were still looking into hers. "I didn't leave any fun," she said. "I left a boring and horrible school that was nothing like home. How do I feel? Like I've been taken to paradise, as if I, who thought I was alone in the world, had found a friend to love." She stopped talking, and he, seeing the black belt on her white dress, said in the softest, most gentle voice, "I am so sorry. Will you forgive me?" "I did not know." His voice shook with emotion. Stella looked up at him with a smile that showed through her tears. Why should you know?" "Yes, I was alone in the world. My father died a year ago." "Forgive me," he murmured. He lightly touched her arm. "Please forgive me. It was unkind and thoughtless." "No," said Stella. "How could you know? If I had been kinder, I might have guessed." There was a short pause, then Stella spoke. "Yes, it is paradise. I did not know England was like this. They called it the land of fogs." "You have not seen London on a November evening," he said, laughing. "Most people who come to England stay in a hotel in the West End of London and judge the whole country by what they see there. Very few come even this far. You have not been to London." I passed through it, said Stella. That is all. But I heard a lot about it last night, she added with a smile. Yes, he said with great interest last night. Yes, at Mrs. Hamilton's. She was kind and invited me to an evening party. One of the guests tried very hard to tell me how important and amazing London is. He looked at her. May I ask who she was? He said. It was not a woman, but a man. It was Mr. Adelstone. Lord Leicester thought for a moment. Adelstone. Adelstone. I don't know him. Before she realized it, Stella replied quickly. He knows you. He looked at her with a thoughtful smile. Does he? I don't remember him. Wait, yes, isn't he related to Mr. Fielding? His nephew, said Stella, and as she felt his deep, piercing eyes on her, she blushed a little. It annoyed her, and she tried to stop it, but the blush came, and he saw it. I remember him now, he said. A tall, thin, dark man. A lawyer, I think. Yes, I remember him. And he told you about London. Yes, said Stella, and as she remembered the talk from a few hours ago, her face turned redder. He is very funny and knows a lot, and he was very kind to explain things to me. I was very grateful. There was something in her voice that made him look at her with a question in his eyes. I think, he said, you are easily made grateful. Oh, no, she replied quickly. I am the most ungrateful person. Isn't that uncle sitting there? She added quickly, to change the subject. He looked up. Yes, he is working hard. I didn't think I could get him to come. It was my sister's name that made it happen. He likes your sister, said Stella, thoughtfully. His eyes were on her immediately. He talked about her, he said. Stella wished she hadn't said that. Yes, she said. He told me about her. I asked him whose house it was on the hills. You mean the hall? He said, pointing with his whip. Yes, and he told me. I knew from how he talked about your sister that he liked her. Her name is Lillian, isn't it? Yes, he said, Lillian, and he said the name softly. I think everyone who knows her loves her. This picture is for her. Stella looked up at his face. It was hard to imagine him being anything but gentle at that moment. Lady Lillian likes pictures, she asked. Yes, he said. She loves art in all its forms. Yes, that little sketch will make her very happy. I don't even know how to say it. What do women like the most? Stella laughed. Diamonds, don't they? Do you like them? He asked. I don't think so. Why not? She replied quickly. Why shouldn't I like what other women like? Yes, I like diamonds. I like everything beautiful and expensive and rare. I remember once going to a ball in Florence. He looked at her. Just to watch it, she exclaimed. I was too young to be there, and they took me to a gallery above the big room, and I watched the ladies in their beautiful dresses and shining jewels, and I thought I would give anything to be like them, and that thought ruined my fun. I remember leaving in tears. It was so dark and lonely in the big gallery, and I felt so small and unimportant. And she laughed. He listened with great interest. Every word she said was charming to him. He had never met a girl or a woman like her, so honest and open. Listening to her was like looking into a clear lake where everything is visible and pure. And are you wiser now? He asked. Not at all, she replied. I still wouldn't like being shut in a dark gallery while others have fun. Isn't that a sign of being jealous and bad? Yes, he agreed, with a smile barely showing under his mustache. I should predict all kinds of bad things for you. As he spoke, he opened the gate for her, keeping the dogs back with a crack of his whip so she could go first, a small act, but it showed his character. The painter looked up. Keep those dogs away from me, Leicester, he said. Well, Stella, did you mix your poison? Stella went and looked over his shoulder. Yes, uncle, she said. You took forever to come back, he said, looking at the view he was drawing. Stella lowered her head, feeling embarrassed because they had walked slowly across the meadows. How's it going? Lord Leicester asked. The old man grumbled. Pretty good. Better than it will be now that you're here making a fuss. Lord Leicester chuckled. That's a pretty clear hint that he wants us to leave, Miss Etheridge. Should we disappear? Stella giggled and sat down on the grass. That's just my uncle's way of asking us to stay, she said. Lord Leicester laughed and sent the dogs away, then sat down close to her. Was I right about the view? He asked, pointing with his whip. Not at all, Stella replied. It's beautiful, beautiful, and that's all there is to say. I wish you'd be happy just saying that and not insist on me painting it, Mr. Etheridge said. Lord Leicester stood up. That's enough. We won't stay here to be insulted, Miss Etheridge, he said. Stella stayed where she was. He came and stood over her, looking down at her quietly. What lovely woods, she said. You were right. They're covered with primroses. We don't have any in our meadow. Do you want to go get some? He asked. Stella looked up at him. Yes, but I don't want to swim across. He smiled, went to the bank, untied a boat, and jumped in, calling to her. Stella jumped up with excitement when she saw the boat, not expecting anything better than walking through the rushes. Is that really a boat? She exclaimed. Come and see, he said. She went to the water's edge and looked at it. How did it get here? She asked. I pay a ferry to drop a boat from the sky whenever I need one. I see, Stella said, nodding seriously. He laughed. How did you think I got here? Did you think I swam? He joked, arranging a cushion. She laughed. I forgot. How silly of me. Will you get in? He asked. Stella looked back at her uncle, then hesitated. He'll tell you I won't let you drown, he said. I'm not scared. Do you think I'm scared? She said, sounding annoyed. Yes, I think you're shaking with nerves right now, he said. She put her foot, her small, shapely foot on the edge of the boat, and he reached out and took her hand to steady her. The boat rocked a bit because of her sudden movement. She stumbled a little, and he had to hold her arm to steady her. So, with one hand holding her hand and the other her arm, he held her for a moment or longer. Then he helped her onto the cushion and sat down, picking up the oars and pushing off. Stella leaned back and let her hand trail in the water. It's something most women do in a boat. They want to feel the water closer. He rowed slowly across the stream. The sun shone brightly, making their path on the water look like rippling gold and turning Stella's hair a rich brown. No wonder he couldn't stop looking at her face. To him, beauty was the most important thing in life, and Stella's face was so beautiful, fresh and pure. Unaware of his gaze, Stella leaned back, watching the water. He rowed in silence, not wanting to ruin the moment. He thought about what he had said to his sister the night before. But she's even more beautiful, he thought. She's lost in thought. She's forgotten everything. Oh, what if I could make her fall in love? For a moment, he felt a rush of emotion, then guilt washed over him. No, that would be cruel, he thought. But to see her eyes light up with love, for her to smile because of me, would be worth anything. They were so lost in thought that they jumped when the boat touched the bank. So soon, Stella said. How beautiful it is. I think I was daydreaming. And I know I was, he said, standing up and offering his hand. But Stella jumped out of the boat without taking it. He tied up the boat and followed her. She was already picking primroses. Without a word, he joined her. Sometimes they were so close that she could feel his breath on her hair, so close that their hands almost touched. Finally, she sat down on the grass with a laugh and, pointing to her hat full of primroses, said, I've picked enough. Don't pick any more. It's wasteful. Are you sure you have enough? He asked. Why stop when there are so many? No more, she said. I already feel guilty. He looked at the handful of flowers he had gathered, and she laughed when she saw his expression. You don't know what to do with the ones you have, but you still want more. Here, you should tie them in bunches. Show me, he said, and sat down next to her. She made bundles of flowers and tied them with a stem of fern. He tried to do the same, but his hands weren't as skilled as hers, so he handed the big bundle to her. You do it, he said. She laughed and tried to tie the fern around the bundle, but it broke and the flowers fell over their hands. They both reached for them, and their hands touched. Stella laughed for a moment, but then stopped when she realized he was still holding her hand. She pulled her hand away and stood up. I should go, she said. My uncle might worry about where I am. She looked nervously at the water. He knows you're safe here, he said. Wait, don't go yet. Up there, we can see the river for miles. It's not far. Will you come? She hesitated, then walked with him between the trees. They soon reached a flat area with a mossy rock and some rough steps. He climbed up and held out his hand. Stella hesitated. It's worth it. Come, he said, and she took his hand and stepped up beside him. Look, he said. Stella exclaimed in delight. Do you regret coming? He asked. I didn't expect it to be so beautiful, she said. He stood next to her, not looking at the view, but at her eyes filled with happiness, her lips slightly open, and her lovely profile. She turned suddenly, so he raised his hand and pointed out things in the view. What's that little house over there? Stella asked. That's one of the lodges, he said. One of your own lodges? She asked. Yes, he nodded. Belongs to my father. That's a lot, she said. Too much for one person, you think? He smiled. Many others think so too. This is one of our smallest estates. Stella looked at the view dreamily. One of the smallest? I've heard you're very rich. That must be nice. I don't know, he said. It's hard to tell without experiencing being poor. There's always something more to want. She smiled skeptically. What more could you possibly want? She said. He smiled strangely, then his face turned serious. You can't guess, and I can't tell you. But trust me, standing here, there's something I long for deeply. His voice was like music. She listened and wondered. And you should be so happy, she said. Happy, he echoed, looking at her with a strange expression. You know what the poets say? Don't call anyone happy until they die, you mean? Said Stella. Yes, he said. I don't know what happiness means. I've chased it my whole life, been close to it sometimes, but it's always slipped away. Sometimes I've wanted to stop chasing it, but fate says we must always seek the unattainable. But some people find it, right? Some, he said, only to realize it's not what they thought. Sometimes it's not worth the effort. Sometimes it's just a trick. Not everyone, though. Not everyone, she murmured, moved by his words. No, he said, with a hidden light in his eyes. Some realize true happiness is just out of reach. And rich people have it worse. What if I told you that's how I feel? I'd say I'm sorry, she said softly, then stopped, remembering things she'd heard about him. He laughed, a sound she hadn't heard from him before. You were right to stop, he said. If I get what I deserve, no one will envy me. Let's go back now, said Stella gently. My uncle. He jumped down and held out his hand.